How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the cult of Mao? Explain your answer using sources B and C and your knowledge of the historical context. 8 marks. Here's the mark scheme for this question, which you can find out about in more detail in the overview video. But we do know that all 8 marks here are awarded for AO3, and that's your analysis and evaluation of source utility. All that means really is you making a judgment on how useful this source is to the inquiry that you've been given in the question. In order to make that judgment, you might focus on one of these things, so how accurate it might be, how reliable you think it is, any limitations, so things that it doesn't include or isn't really that helpful for, knowledge of the author which is given to you above the source, or valuable information offered by the source. If you can focus on maybe 1 or 2 of these to decide how useful the source is for your inquiry, it's a really easy way to score highly in AO3. That means that rather than just making an assertion, so saying this source is useful, you need to reason, you need to use one of these factors above to decide how useful the source is. You'll also be thinking about the content, so what the source actually says. You'll be thinking about the context, so what you know about when it was written or what it's written about. And provenance, so who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it, and so on. So just try and keep those things in mind. You don't have to talk about everything, but just try and keep them in mind to make sure that your answer is really nicely focused on utility. It's also important to remember that the question isn't asking you to compare source B and source C. In fact, you could actually talk about them separately. You've got to think about why B is useful and why C is useful, not if one is more useful than the other. Here are the bands for this question. Now you can see in order to score in the highest band, you need to show developed reasoning. So maybe you've used one of the factors that we listed above to make a judgment on how useful the source is and really clearly explain your thinking. You've also considered the provenance, so where the source came from, and how that might impact how useful the source is. You could also draw in some contextual knowledge, so stuff that you already know about the topic, to help you to interpret the source and make that judgment. Essentially, this question is all about stating how useful you think the source is, using the information given to you in the source and before it, and the information that you already have about the topic, to explain why you made that judgment. Showing that you can do this well is how you can score in the highest band. As long as the points you make are relevant to the focus of the question and factually accurate, the examiner will award you the marks. But let's take a look at some examples. So firstly, for source B, you will notice that the mark scheme is divided into 3 subsections. Let's look at the first, the utility of the content of the source. So what does it actually say? You might argue that it depicts Mao as oversized, leading countless much smaller people, maybe giving you an impression of the scale of his power over China. Then moving on to the utility of the source's provenance, so where it comes from, and its purpose, so what it intends to do. You might say then that as a propaganda poster, it depicts the image of Mao that the party wants to create, so an ideal maybe rather than a reality. And that's very useful, it gives us an insight into the party and their intentions. Finally, the utility of the source in relation to its historical context. Now this is your chance to bring in the stuff that you already know to support the argument that you're making. You might say, for example, that the cult was intended to bolster Mao's power and his position following the turmoil of the Great Leap Forward, which sort of diminished his position slightly. Now, if you can link all 3 of those subsections together, it shows that you can approach the question from lots of different angles. You've approached it analytically and you've come up with a really nicely developed point, and that will certainly score you in the top band. Take a look at the rest of the points though, and the same for source C in a second, to see if there's anything you might have added to your answer.